All right. Well, here we are again, everyone. Uh, so you have now watched not one, but two vampire movies. I know, two. Aren't you lucky? Uh, well, I could tell you everything that I know about vampires, and that would take about 10 minutes because vampires were never weirdly my monster of choice, frankly. I was always a Frankenstein guy. But luckily, we have in our very own department an expert on vampires. So you remember Andy, Dr. Andy Owens, from a few weeks ago when we talked about Casino Royale. Well, Andy's written a book on horror films and all sorts of other crazy stuff about horror films. So I figured, why not bring Andy back on board and pick his brain about Near Dark, which I know is actually one of the movies that you're writing about for your book. And then the other film, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, I had never seen. I'm in the same boat as many of you. This is my first time seeing the film, which I watched it this morning. Thought it was great. But Andy is the one who recommended it to me. So I figured, all right, he's the expert. I'm just going to ask him questions. And we're going to learn some stuff, all of us together. That's what's going to be fun about this. So Andy, why don't you maybe start us off by just saying like what's like the back of the book blurb for your book that's coming out in about a year?
The blurb of the back of the book is more or less, summarizing the overall project, which is to give folks who are reading the book both a cultural and industrial history of what I'm calling queer occult media, meaning film and television, from both, from the 1960s to the present. So, sort of tracing these moments throughout the past roughly 60 years, where when in global politics, global sociocultural phenomenon, uh, gender and sexuality seem to be most at issue in some ways. And what I found writing the book is that in those times is when you get particular spikes in the horror film, particularly in horror films that deal with what I'm calling occultism, which I define mostly as vampirism and witchcraft. Right. So um, it's it's sort of a long tail history of how this genre that's been around since forever, follows these trends. And especially in the 1980s, where, as I write about Near Dark, which sort of falls on the tail end of this in '87, it, um, it's interesting to me insofar as the big story that I want to tell in my book, which is not necessarily groundbreaking on my part, but I hope I'm contributing at least a little bit of nuance or new information, is the relationship between the American horror film and the HIV/AIDS crisis, right? Where, and again, as I said, I am far from the first person to make that analogy. But what's so fascinating to me about Near Dark as a film is that most of the films that I've read about in critical literature that have been talked about in terms of their connection with the HIV/AIDS in the '80s have been mostly urban centered, right? And a lot of the reports that were coming out of major news outlets in the 1980s seemed to sort of eerily echo the era that we're in right now, right? Of thinking of this contagion as a mostly urban phenomenon. Right? And the argument that I make in the particular chapter in my book that deals with Near Dark, and the two other main texts are Joel Schumacher's The Lost Boys, which comes out in 1985, and also The Hunger, Tony Scott's The Hunger, which comes out in 1983. Which these films are three very different films that are set in different locations. So I sort of locate one in a major urban center, one in sort of a suburban center, one in very much an urban, or I'm sorry, a rural setting, which I would characterize Near Dark as being the urban setting. And all of them, I think, in their different ways, have this fear on their mind about that anyone is subject to a particular kind of contagion or catching a particular kind of virus or illness, right? And that it doesn't matter if you're in a big city or, if in the case of Near Dark, you're Caleb and you're in Oklahoma, right? That this can still affect you. And I think that's part, at least for me, when I was writing the book, part of what I saw was missing in literature was thinking about how this was a sort of transgeographic phenomenon.
Yeah, so we, or rather I, talked about in the lecture how genre films like Near Dark or other horror films or other Westerns, right on down the list of genres, are having ideological functions, which is the fancy pants way of saying that they, on a deeper level, they are addressing widespread cultural fears that maybe you can't or don't feel comfortable talking about explicitly, which is certainly the case with AIDS in the 1980s, where there's a large group of people out there who are like, we just don't want to talk about that. And genres like horror or like the Western or other genres give people an outlet to express or sort of work through those things that they can't necessarily just talk about. Is that, that sounds like you're saying that that's what's going on in Near Dark, right? Like it's very much just addressing fears around the AIDS crisis through a framework that maybe through sheer familiarity, because we've all seen horror films, we all know what vampires are, you can kind of work some of that stuff out, like a safety valve, like a cultural safety valve.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I certainly don't, as much as, I myself, and I encourage all of my students to sort of try your best to resist the symptomatic reading. I think, but sometimes it's there and it's something that you can contend with, right? Where, in the 80s with something like Near Dark, where, there's not really much that is threatening the rural heartland of America around, circa 1987-ish, until this contagion, right, or this virus comes in, which really, I think, and why I like this film so much is that it really gets to, and Catherine Bigelow, who is the director, has been very articulate about in interviews about this film, is saying that it takes what you might expect about a horror film and places it in an unfamiliar setting, right? Where you might not necessarily expect the American heartland to be upended by a crisis like this, but that's exactly why this film works. And that's what she herself has said in interviews, and what I find quite persuasive, and even when I watch it, is I think she's right. That I think, yes, that is why this film works so well, is that it is, taking the rural heartland of America at a time where not much seemed to threaten this sort of sort of country tranquility, or I don't know a better way to put it. But all of a sudden, this threat of contagion comes in and really upends a particular family's life.
So I'm gonna nerd out with you for a second, Andy, because I want to know what your favorite moments from Near Dark are, and they can be connected to your book, or I'm also interested just hearing, sort of more about like, okay, you're watching the film for the first time, whenever that is, and what is
Mhm.
really kind of blowing you away about the movie. Because I have a couple of things that I mentioned in the lecture as sort of my candidates for like just like the standout moments, and I'm curious to see where you're where like when you're watching the movie, like what's the parts that you're really just you can't wait to see again.
Yeah, I mean, I think I love the first meeting between Caleb and May. You when there is just the dialogue is so cheeky, but it's so well done in a way when she's eating an ice cream cone. He says, um, I'm just dying for a bite, and she says, dying. Like it's so wink wink nudge nudge, right? That I think it's really kind of wonderful. And that's one of my favorite moments. Another one of my favorite moments, which I do talk about in my book, is interestingly enough, um, the moment where we get um, from Caleb's father, right, who is the local town veterinarian in Near Dark. We do get in the middle of the film a successful blood transfusion to get rid of vampirism as a virus, which
I didn't know you could
to
do that.
yeah, which again, I by no means want to call myself an encyclopedia because I'm not, but it is one of the only, if not the only time I have seen that work in a vampire film, where the successful, and it runs the gamut of vampire films. I mean, it happens in Dracula, it happens just in various contexts, but we see in the middle of Near Dark somebody being successfully transfused and turning back from this, from human to being contaminated with vampire blood, to purging themselves with the vampire blood and being fully human again. I've never seen that in another movie ever. I could not tell you another movie that I've seen that done.
Well, you're touching on something that really I find myself appreciating about the film more and more each time I watch it, which is that it is very, very aware that it's a genre movie. Like it's aware that there's something inherently just a little bit ridiculous, from just a pure logic point of view about the whole idea of a vampire to begin with, and rather than dance around that. Like it kind of just has those moments you're pointing to. The movie is just having fun with that. It's just kind of like, for all of the ways that it's very much a serious horror film where its primary goal is to kind of get you worked up and in a tense state of mind. It is also letting you kind of have some fun because they know that that they know that it's they're playing with these
Right.
conventions that are just so ingrained, these tropes of the vampire can't go out at night, the blood is the thing that makes them vampires, and it's having fun with that. My
Yeah, no, it is. And I was just going to say that I think the thing that also another moment that I always appreciate in the film, and that again I write about in my book, and that I am not the only person to write about, is the end of the film, where the second successful transfusion is of May, right? And it's it's such an interesting scene. I mean, you can watch it 100 times and see different things, but for my money, what I write about is that um, May didn't necessarily dislike being a vampire, right? And there was something about the ish. There are great lines of dialogue that are not coming to me at the top of my head, but sort of about the freedom of the night and the sort of uh, aching beauty of it, and things like that. Where at the end of the movie, when she is successfully transfused by Caleb's father, there's a great shot where he is embracing her, and there's an over the shoulder shot, and you can see her facial expressions, and it's not an expression of joy. It is an expression of what I would call profound ambivalence at best, right? Um, about someone making a decision for her life that she was not a part of, right? That in this sort of traumatic, the third act of the film, that she doesn't ask necessarily to be rescued, or to be, transfused and not made a vampire anymore. And that is one of the things that always lingers with me about this film is, she never asked for that. And so that quite literally, I think, haunts the end of the movie.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thing to bring up just in the context of what we were talking about a few weeks ago with Casino Royale and the ways that these films are often conforming in the broad strokes to that convention of making the woman the damsel in distress. But when you look at the really good films, you often see some effort to complicate that, if not outright overturn it. And given that genre films are, if anything, more bound to these formulas than non-genre films, if you can find them, you often see in the more conventional vampire films a much more straightforward or simplistic relationship between femininity and vampirism. And here, if you're not looking at it very carefully, if you're just kind of watching it and seeing it as a real fun action movie, yeah, you're going to have a good time. But if you're looking to see how the film is not totally in line with some of these conventions, I mean, you're going to find it in these little moments where it's almost like they're sneaking in like complexity into a movie where you don't necessarily think you're going to get it based on the content of the poster. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Near Dark does so well is that it is a genre hybrid, and I think insofar as it is a genre hybrid, and I would nominate it at least in three categories: action, horror, and western. Uh, I think it hits really specific notes in all three of those categories really well. And that's why I think, as a genre film, like it plays really well.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I always love watching Near Dark. I would actually add there might be as a fourth genre that we can add to that list, and that's the '80s movie. Because man, that Tangerine
Sure.
Dream
Yeah.
soundtrack, it's like that's a
Yeah.
genre that is
Ooh.
very much a retroactive one, but like man, you want a good '80s movie? You're gonna watch Michael Mann's
Yeah,
Thief, and you're gonna watch Near Dark, and you're gonna
right.
love
And
Tangerine.
Near Dark, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um.
yeah.
So okay. So now we're gonna segue to talking about this week's film. Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, which if you have not yet watched, you can find it on the modules section of Icon, or you can just go to Canopy's website, punch in your information, and it's there too. So as I said
And
earlier,
you have me to thank for that we got it
yes,
to the library.
yes, and that's exactly what I was about to say. Actually, was that this is my first time watching this film because especially when we made the shift to online, I'm just like, I don't want to make y'all watch The Headless Woman. I mean, it's a great film. It's a great film. You should watch it. But like, man, it's just not as fun to watch on your computer as it is to watch in a big theater. So come back in a future semester. We'll all watch that movie together, all five of us. It'll be great.
Yeah, and we'll all have a kiki. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be five
Yeah.
people. It's not going to be a lot of people. Take me up on this,
Yeah.
but we'll do it. We'll do it if you want to do it. But I was like racking my brains about what to swap it out with, and Andy over here recommended A Girl Walks Home Alone at Nights, which I had never seen, and I watched it this morning. So I'm still actively kind of processing what I am thinking about the film, and that's really where those journal questions that you're answering this week are coming from. If you haven't yet read those, they're up on Icon. Check them out. But the gist of them is question one: how is this movie like European art cinema? Because it's very obviously like European art cinema in a couple of key respects. Stylistically, how it tells its story, some of the devices it uses, the way it sets up the situation, et cetera, et cetera. Very, very like out of the European art film playbook. But there's also a lot of weird things about it that are not don't totally have precedence in European art cinema and have more precedence in some of those other kinds of international film that I discussed in the lecture. So this is all just a way of saying, Andy, like what really just jumps out at you about this movie? You teach this also for transnational art cinema. What are your big takeaways? Like why for you is this a great film for illustrating the breadth of different kinds of things that filmmakers around the world are doing?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, I think this film, to me, I have a deep affection for this film, and it's not that I have any personal connection to it. The first time I saw it, I really kind of fell in love with it, and I have loved it ever since. I think in terms of why I often do teach it for transnationalism and why I think it works so beautifully in that tradition is that it is directed by an Iranian American woman named Lily Mirpour, who has been independent film director, has had quite a bit of success, sort of straddling the indie slash DIY scene, right? This is certainly her biggest film that she's ever made, getting backing through the likes of Vice and whatnot. But this was also, at least a shorter version of this film, was her thesis film at UCLA, getting an MFA in filmmaking. And so I like seeing the creative process that this film has gone through. Also, if you see the really beautiful Kino Lorber edition of this that was put on Blu-ray, there is a graphic novel that was actually attached to this film that you can read. And so why I think it works so beautifully is that it is the product of the directorial and writing imagination of an Iranian American woman, also headlined by one of her very close friends, Sheila Vand, who plays the girl, who is also an Iranian American woman. And I think that that really speaks volumes to this film's appeal transnationally, because you don't really know when you're watching the film where and when Bad City is. You get a sense that every time I watch this film, it seems like it's maybe set in the 80s/90s. It seems like it's a couple decades before where we're at. That as much as they try to approximate Bad City being in Iran, this film was filmed in Northern California, which I think there are some pretty clear signs in the film where you can tell it was not filmed in Iran, that it was probably filmed, north of LA somewhere. But I kind of love that about the film, because I think that it is truly the product of a transnational filmmaker, whose parents were first gen coming over here. That she very much has. There are great interviews. If any of you who are taking Professor Singleton's class are interested in this film, there are really great interviews with her on YouTube where she talks about writing the script for this film, and that she actually first had to think of the dialogue in Farsi and then in English. And so her process of translation is just really fascinating to me, about her vision for this film, what she wanted. And I think that has really interested me as a movie that is very much, it is westernized in some ways, right? But it seems very much sort of a piece with a transnational environment. And I think that speaks to, the awards that it won and the accolades that it has gotten. Its influence, as you said, from European art cinema, that there are those moments in it where, for instance, the great moment where she and the guy who I'm blanking on his name right now, forgive me. The main guy, not Hussein, who's the dad, but the dad of that character, where they are in her apartment, right? And she puts on a record, and they're like slowly coming together, and there's a disco ball, and it just, it takes forever, right? And that it's so much of an art cinema tradition of sort of elongated sequences of thinking about psychological reality and things like that, which may strike some people as tedious or elongated, and I don't know, I vacillate on that, where I think it's kind of a great moment.
Yeah, that one especially, I really liked that scene in the film. This is such a great moment for the cat to show up, because I loved that cat showing up in the movie too.
Yes, I should say, I would be totally remiss if I did not say that every time I show this film, I always tell my students, Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor for that cat in this movie, because that cat is fantastic.
Oh man, like the end, talk about like you're talking about classic art film,
right, where the two of them are in there and the cat is in the it's so good.
It's great because it's, this is maybe one place where a near dark connection can be made, but I really liked it because it's such the trope of like, I talk at the lecture how, that every time you see the words "the end" in an art film, it needs a question mark. So I added some question marks
right
to the credits. And that one is such a play on that idea, because it's like, what will happen next? But like, there's that fucking cat right in the middle,
Yeah, no, and it's
right at
great.
you.
Yeah, and it is great because the cat in this movie is such a wonderful moment of sort of levity. Um, and yeah, I mean, best supporting actor nomination for the cat.
Yeah, man, I love the cat.
Yeah, the cat in the film is really kind of incredible.
Yeah, so we were talking about cat stuff and the film playing with art film conventions. I mean, I think the thing I found when I was just kind of, I didn't do super a lot of research. I'm just going to go ahead and be honest with everybody. But I did, when I was Googling around, I found this great image of the director wearing like an I Love David Lynch kind of like t-shirt or something. And it's good to know that this was like originated as like a thesis project because it just feels so like fanish in a weird way. Like you can tell she's watched a lot of movies, in addition to the art films we've been talking about.
Yeah,
Like, I mean, spaghetti
yeah,
westerns, man. Like, I mean, isn't she lifting Ennio Morricone music
yeah,
from the Leone films?
yeah. I mean, and one of the things I always tell folks about when I screen this film is that it was billed when it premiered at Sundance, which I believe was in 2014. Was that it was billed as the world's first feminist Iranian vampire western.
Mm-hmm.
Which, if you're thinking about genre, right, it's like, well, that's a party of one. Uh, but
Right.
yeah, I mean, there are especially those sort of wide angle tracking shots of Bad City with the open graves where bodies are being poured into that are completely out of the Western. You know, there's obviously elements of a horror film that yeah, and I think, as you were saying, one of the things I do appreciate is that Anna Lillian Mayerpour, she did her homework about these conventions.
Right. No, I mean it's really you can tell that she's a big cinephile. I mean the name that kept coming to mind was Antonioni, who I do a little bit on La Ventura in the lecture, and I just every time you
Mhm.
had like these like long shots of the characters framed against these billowing smokestacks, it was just like, oh man, I just
Right,
couldn't
it's
stop
like,
thinking
oh man,
Red Desert, and some of those other
yeah.
Antonioni films where he's like framing them in such a way as to just evoke the idea of alienation in just in an image.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I think that's what again, one of the things I find very interesting about this film is that um, even the idea that they're in Bad City, like it seems to be quite a city of alienation, right? There's no community to speak of. I mean, certainly, like there's no law enforcement, there's no cops. Uh, and so one of the things I like about that, and that I often characterize the girl as, is she's Batman, right? That she's kind of
right.
dealing out vigilante justice in some ways, which is one of the things I love about this film.
Mhm.
Uh, but at the same time, yeah, it takes place in a setting that is one of profound alienation, of isolation, of no community, of characters who are kind of misfits, but at the end of the day, that perhaps the girl and Arash kind of find each other.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, the point about where the film is being made is really, I think, one that will it took me by surprise because it's not something that the film announces so overtly by showing you
Right.
like Los Angeles or the Hollywood sign or something. So I'm betting that a lot
Yeah.
of the people watching us talk will be equally interested to learn that the film is not set where you immediately think it's going to be set, which is Iran. And I think that that just does so much in and of itself to create cognitive dissonance, because you see something that, again, if you've seen a lot of Westerns, you know, like some of those moments are just like straight out of a Western. Like there's a couple of moments where they're even doing like a standoff. And if
Right.
you have, but like, you know, it's at the same time, if you've ever seen a 50s high school comedy, I mean, those suburbs are like right off the postcards, man. Like, so, but it's doubling for Iran. And so you have this weird sort of tension where you can't really figure out where the film is, you know? And I think that does a lot to just evoke
Yeah.
these feelings that you're describing.
Yeah. No, it's true, and that it feels, or I think it attempts to feel like it is everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
Right, right. No, I really liked that element of the film because one of the things I've been talking about actually in one of my other classes on American independent cinema is just how so many filmmakers who are not working in Hollywood and who don't necessarily have access to private jets, and like, you know, they can't fly all over the world to get the perfect location. They have to make do with what they have. And we've talked about in that class George Romero doing that with Pittsburgh, which is where I'm at right now. We've talked about John Waters doing that with Baltimore. And it's great to see her kind of put even a unique spin on that idea of being like, well, I'm going to use the resources that I have, which is, as you pointed out, her friends, you know, her backyard, basically, in some senses. But
Yeah.
I'm still going to make this film that I would be making if I did have the access to these resources. We'll just be creative. You know, I think that's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
yeah. Well, that just seems like a real good thing for so many of our production-minded students to think about, right? Like, I mean, this is sort of like the dream, you know, if you want to be a filmmaker.
Yeah. And it's a film that, yeah, you could, I think, I forget if the director Lily Mirport says this, or if it was an interview with another filmmaker, but I feel like it's very much whomever was giving this advice. Um, it's a good one that you ideally, if you're coming to a project, you should be able to, you know, in an ideal world, be able to envision being able to make that project for, say, $10,000, and being able to make the project for $1 million.
Is that how much this film cost? Do you know the budget offhand, or
No, I don't, but I'm just saying that I think that this particular film reminds me of that anecdote, and forgive me, I don't know who it was, but it was to say that, you know, that's the mark of a really great filmmaker.
yeah, well, I mean, it's funny. I, as you know, students from listening to the lecture, or as you will soon know, I spend a lot of time talking about European art cinema, a little bit less on international commercial cinemas and third cinema, and then I just kind of have a few quick, like, here's some thoughts on regional cinema. And I'm thinking more and more that this is almost an example of regional cinema, which the Stephen Crofts article that you know, Andy and I have read, that you will soon read, basically
Sure.
just is like, yeah, there's not many of these. Here they are. But it almost feels like this is an example of regional cinema in some ways. Like, I mean, it's a very
Yeah.
small scale movie, kind of made as much for the people who are participating in the project as it is for the festival market. You know, it seems like it's kind of a very like grassroots, homegrown kind of effort. So, I mean, well, you said earlier she's part of the DIY kind of filmmaking community. So
Yeah,
that's, you see that
for
here, you
sure.
know, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that it shows a lot of a lot of creativity, a lot of ingenuity on, you know, what could have been a wide scale budget,
Right.
depending on what she had to work with.
So, so the question that I feel like I want to throw at you, because I imagine that at least a few students might be like, that all sounds great, but man, the movie really was kind of slow. Like, what do you say
Mm.
to that criticism that, this is really creative, it's really cool that she was able to make this. That all sounds great, but I probably would rather watch Near Dark because it has like way more blood. What would you say to that resistant viewer?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it for me it's so contextual because at least from our perspective as Americans who largely have not been trained um, in a global cinema tradition, or at least in a particular regional or national cinema, to the amount that we have been trained to recognize the norms and standards of Hollywood cinema. What I think is so fascinating about this film is to see, okay, like what, and to be sure from someone who is an Iranian American, but what does an Iranian vampire film look like? Right. And I think that that for me is so fascinating, because I, as someone who again is very steeped in that particular genre and feels like I know the nuts, the bolts, the cracks. This film was surprising for me, and it did new things, and uh, that's what I hold up as the hallmark of really great filmmaking, is that I want to see something new.
Yeah, yeah,
So I think one of the great things about genre cinema, as much as I think this film is genre cinema, is that what it has going for it is taking uh, a very well-trodden Western trope, in terms of the vampire myth or mythology, and translating it into a different global context in which it makes you pay attention to that context, because it's not the same. Yeah. And I think that for me, that's one of the reasons why I like this film so much.
yeah, yeah. Well, I'm with you on that for sure, and I think that's an idea we even if you don't really love the film necessarily, I think most of us can get behind that idea on some level, that like even if these films aren't necessarily as action packed as a Hollywood film, that's not necessarily what they're trying to do. They're trying, as you're saying, I think, to be like, that's all well and good. We love that. And I think it's obvious that, this
Mhm.
film is in love with its source material, but it's doing its own thing. It's using the fact that it can get
Yeah.
away with being a smaller budget, smaller fair, smaller scale affair, to like linger on the moments that the other films brush right past. I mean, I'm always thinking about that very famous Alfred Hitchcock quote that the movies are life with the boring bits cut out. And I like to joke
Mhm.
that the art film is movies with the boring bits left in. But as you're saying,
Right.
the boring bits are also the places where the film really, for me at least, was really evocative and, created interesting feelings. I mean, normally I'm just not thinking, when I watch a vampire movie, maybe we just talk about this in the language of emotion for a sec, but I'm usually like,
Mhm.
ah, or like, and I'm not usually like existential dread, but now that I've
Yeah,
had that
and
experience, they fit
and
together really
yeah,
well.
and there is a lot of I think through both the writing and the filmmaking itself, that there is a lot of great, great, dare I say, existential dread in this film, particularly with things that, and again, if you want to compare it to the norms of classical Hollywood cinema that maybe don't hold up. like, you know, the girl's uh, several interactions with the little boy, right? Where she asks, you know, have you been a good boy? You know, or like basically, you know, I'm going to be telling you for the rest of your life, like, so you better like be good. Which is such a creepy moment. Like that scene is so creepy. Uh, and you get it because you get that again in the spirit of Batman. She's kind of vigilante justice, and she wants to sort of clean up what's going on. Um, but narratively, that doesn't go anywhere, right? And so, yeah, that for me is it's an interesting sort of pocket or nugget in the film where it feels like okay, yeah, there's something there, and they don't do anything with it necessarily, but it's almost more fun to me to imagine why it's there in the first place. And like I just said, like I can get having, and I think this is a film, like many others in our cinema tradition, that rewards rewatching. That I get having seen this film several times. That I think what's going on is again, you know, this sort of the girl, the vampire, as the you know sort of regime change, if you want to call it that, or doling out vigilante justice, that she is putting, you know, the small children of that city on notice. You know, basically, and saying like, this is not going to be the way this city operates anymore.
Well, so that's, oh man, it's so great. What I kept thinking about was the David Bordwell quote, which is also included in the lecture for those of you who've yet to watch it, where he's talking about how in art films the question is really, the questions that you ask are really very author-centered, for lack of a better word. Like, why is the filmmaker doing this, that, or the other thing? And this is maybe a place where maybe what we're really saying here, Andy, is that there's not really necessarily a lot, when you boil it down, that distinguishes art films from other genres. Because I feel like when we were talking about Near Dark, we were all just kind of having a conversation about why is Catherine Bigelow setting the story up this way? And one of your answers was because it really speaks to the culture.
Right.
And it seems like the same thing is happening here, where it's also, she is like reworking you're asking these questions about why these things are there, and your answers are coming down to because it makes the genre more interesting, it makes it more relevant to her audience, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you could say the same sentences about both of these films that we've been talking about. And so my mind is kind of coming back to this idea that, like, is it fair to say that art films are just maybe another genre of film, like the Western, like
Yeah.
the horror film?
I think so in some ways. Something that we might consider more cerebral, perhaps, right? But what I think actually distinguishes, because I am someone who, in my research and my teaching, I like going for, the low object or the cheap joke, right? Because I think that's sort of where the money's at, intellectually, is that, art cinema, the way I like to characterize art cinema is that art cinema, all films think, right? All films at a certain level think. Art cinema thinks on its sleeve. Right? Not every kind of cinema thinks on its sleeve in terms of letting you know or putting you on notice from the start of the film that it is actively thinking in an intellectual / cerebral / metaphorical, philosophical, call it whatever you want kind of way, right? I think that is one of the hallmarks of art cinema, is that it puts you on notice about those big deal questions right up front. But what I think one of the beauties of film criticism is, and why I am perpetually interested in the social distinctions we draw between high and low culture, is that alt films think.
Right. Well, this is, I think, one of the reasons why, if I can just pat myself on the back here for a second, I'm glad that I had the opportunity to rework the syllabus, because I think the Near Dark and the Girl Walks Home Alone at Night pairing is a great illustration of that principle you just outlined, because Near Dark, as we've discussed, is so deeply invested in thinking about why vampires are relevant in the late 1980s, and thinking about how that formula can be combined and reworked with other formulas. But it doesn't necessarily want you to notice that in the first viewing. It wants you to be blown away by, the blood, the fear, the action, all the great stuff. Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, as you've been saying, we've been talking about for a little while now, is kind of basically doing the same thing, but in a much more overt way, where you go into it expecting that it's going to do that because it's an art film, and
Right.
the film foregrounds all of these questions through those moments where, yeah, like not much is happening, because they're expecting that you're going to be processing and thinking and
Right.
thinking with the film, as you very eloquently, I think, put it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I always like to think about when I watch movies, is the extent to which the film is sort of earmarking for us the extent to which we are supposed to actively think along with it.
yeah, and this is one of the reasons why I think art films work really, really well if you get the chance to see them in a theater. So this is, if you're a skeptic, this is my plea to the skeptics. Try seeing a few in theaters. Give it a go.
Yeah.
They actually work really,
Yeah.
really well in a theater. There's something about watching them on a TV. I actually have a good time watching them on computer. There's something about the really focused computer viewing that is conducive to art films. But theater, this is why film festivals exist, is because
Yeah.
it's you got to go see it.
Yeah, and at least in my experience, that you encounter as a viewer reactions you might not expect from art cinema.
Yeah. No, that's the thing that's nice about it, is it does. I like, my favorite art films are always the ones, frankly, that are kind of reworking classic Hollywood genres. Just go ahead and throw that out there. I mean, this is, I don't know. I'm just thinking of Wim Wenders' The American Friend, a film I watched again recently. It's just oh man, it's just him taking a Patricia Highsmith thriller and about a sociopath and turning it into this crazy art. Yeah, anyway, we can talk about these other films all day long. I did have one more question before I think we should wrap things up, and it's the same question as with Near Dark. Okay, what are the best parts of the movie for you? What are the parts that, just independently of any smart, just the parts where you're just oh man, I love that part. It's just so good.
Yeah, I love the part where she goes back to the drug dealer's apartment and bites his finger off and kills him. I love that. I think that's great.
Well, it's that moment is great because that's one of the payoffs for making you wait almost 30 minutes before the vampire part starts, is that when
there is actually a payoff. It's great.
Well, that's
narrative.
where she's aware of these conventions, that's because it's you're at that point, you're oh my God, it's an art film. What have I gotten myself into? And then it's okay. That's pretty funny. It's pretty hilarious.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, I love that moment. I love the moment, as I said earlier, where Arash and the girl are in her apartment, and there's like that 80s, soundtrack with the disco ball, and they're like about to kiss, and it just take I screen time, I don't know how long it is, but it just feels like forever, like that scene goes on. um i I love that scene, because I think it does the work it needs to do in terms of talking about the sort of the sexual tension between these two characters, but also about the sort of, in the diegesis, obviously the split between different worlds, quite literally. And then yeah, those wonderful sort of moments of maybe, dare we call it, black or dark humor, right? Where, at the end, I love at the end, as you said, like the cat is just A plus in like that one of those final shots where the two of them are in the car and the cat is in the middle. The cat just stared at the camera, and it's just like, well, do we leave? Do we go back? Like, I think like A plus. Like, that's a great shot.
Oh man, yeah, it's a really fun movie. I mean, that's the thing. It's like once you dive into the world of art film, I mean, maybe this is the takeaway we'll leave you with. Once you start diving into the world of art film, you actually start seeing that the very best art films have a sense of humor about how silly some of these conventions
Oh yeah,
can be. Just
absolutely.
as much as horror films or westerns can do that too. I mean, there's just it, it's
Yeah,
just
I mean, that's the
have some
thing
fun,
that
you know.
right at that at the heart of any level of absurdity is, absurdity is based in a certain sense on a certain kind of whimsy, right? Like that we know this is absurd, and there's something kind of fun about that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's just great to see that principle being equally applied to, again, the idea of vampires, but also just the whole like the whole art film kind of idea that she clearly loves too. I don't want to convey that she doesn't love art cinema, but
No, of
she's
course.
totally
I
kind of
mean,
like poking
you,
fun and have
right, and you
whole, like,
can, and that's what one of the things also, I just to say real quickly, that I love about art cinema is that art cinema invites different reading protocols, which I really love. That, you can read Girl Walks Home Alone at Night as a very sort of straight-laced high art film. You can read it as a campy genre film, and you can read it as everything in between.
right. Yeah, no, I mean that's something I think that all the great films do is kind of require you to actively interpret and argue about that interpretation with yourself, with your friends, your professors, anyone who wants to talk about movies.
Yeah, yeah.
So maybe that's the best place to leave it. Thank you once again, Andy. That I'm all in the
Pleasure.
vampire spirit now. We're nowhere near Halloween. How did that happen? Cool. Well, if you enjoyed the video, just send us an email at some point. We'd love to know who's listening, and if you do that, that's how I'll know who's really listening. I'll bonus points. Always bonus points. Just show me that you're engaged, and you're going to be happy with your grade at the end of the semester. See, Andy knows. All right. See you next time, y'all.